Wezathiye Hale, and thanks for 10,000 subscribers. It's really actually more like 15 now, but who cares? This is the promised Q&A video that I announced that I was going to do on Twitter, on YouTube, and on Patreon. So I'll be taking your questions that you posed in either of those three locations and giving the best answer that I can. I figured now is also a good time to announce that I kind of sat down, thought about it, and figured that I could be doing better than just giving the sort of blank patrons slide at the beginning of each video. So I made like a little intro video. I don't want to give the impression of just copying Jackson Crawford and literally everything I do, but I did like that he really uses this sort of like Western philologist aesthetic. And I thought, it would be interesting to experiment with what I could do in a sort of Baltimore East Coast version of that. So you're going to see it now for the first time. Stay tuned for the Q&A afterwards. Okay, our first question comes from Patreon. This is from Brandon. I'd be interested to know how you got into all this stuff and what set you down the path of studying and learning old languages. Also, did you have any advice for someone aiming to learn Old English themselves in their own time? Book recommendations, etc. could also be a good one to cover for Latin. Cheers, Graham, and all the best. Cheers to you too. So I get a couple different versions of this question in this Q&A, so I'm going to give a kind of different sort of answer each time. I'll talk about here what originally got me interested in Old English, and that's a pretty easy answer: Lord of the Rings. So like I think most men in my generation, I fell in love with Lord of the Rings when I watched the movies as a child. And then as I got older, I realized that I had never read the books in a kind of serious way. I had read them, quote unquote, as a kid, but I just kind of skipped around to the battle parts and then realized that they were less interesting than watching it on a screen. But when I was about 20, I decided to read the books, for real, really treat them seriously. And I loved them so much, so much. It's currently my favorite book ever written. I think it's one of the best things ever written. And yeah, so from there, I wanted to know what made this guy tick, which if you know him well, you'll know that he actually hated getting asked that question. One time someone asked, what makes you tick? And he said, I don't tick, I'm not a clock, but if I did, you should probably ask whoever made me, which is kind of an interesting way to answer that question. But I wanted to know what he was interested in. And I, in researching his life, realized pretty quickly that before he ever started writing anything relating to Middle Earth, he already knew so much about Old English, about Germanic languages in general, about Germanic mythology and philology and sound changes and linguistics, and so much. So I decided I wanted to know all that stuff too. And so I began studying Old English as the thing that he really primarily studied and taught for several decades at Oxford. And then from there, I began to branch out other medieval languages and stuff like that. As for advice for someone aiming to learn Old English themselves in their own time, so there is a reader for beginners called Oswald Bera, made by my friend Colin Gorey. It's a good place to start, especially if you pair it with other things. So I have a couple videos on this channel called Learn Old English in Old English. They're not of the highest quality. I made them kind of before I knew what I was doing, but that is a decent place to start. I kind of walk through some comprehensible input in Old English. As you learn languages, you're going to want to hear it and read it most, but hearing it is the most important thing. So if you can record yourselves reading parts of this book, and then listen back to that, that's great. There's going to be an audiobook coming out eventually. But then also, if you want to listen to some of the recordings I've made in Old English, I think that will help as well. You just want to kind of get as much input as possible. As long as you can understand what's going on, try to read as much as possible. There's also Peter Baker's online anthology, which has every word glossed. So you can go to his first reading, which is the Fall of Adam and Eve, and you can just go in and you can read, so nadre, what does nadre mean? You can just click on it and it'll tell you that it means snake. And that's a really quick and easy way to learn a language, is this kind of immediate translation, and then, now I know what that means, let's read it again. And, once you go through a sentence and you find, I've got this word, and this word that I don't understand. Let's read all those real quick. Okay, this one means snake. This one means clever. This one means animal. And then read through the sentence again. Suddenly, you make those connections because you just learned what the words mean. So it's a really effective, quick way of learning a language. In any language learning, whatever's easy and fun for you is going to be the best way to learn that language. If you hate doing it, you're not going to learn it. So yeah, try to do things that are easy and engaging and fun. The next question comes from WynkynNod. I'm curious to know what has surprised you about how your videos have performed and which types of videos get the most views and engagement. And given the feedback, does it influence what kind of videos you plan to make? I imagine you need to balance what content you most enjoy creating with content your audience seems to enjoy the most. Yeah, definitely. So one thing that I've really been surprised with are the shorts. I had no idea how many people were going to watch these just kind of quick blurbs about fun facts about Old English or Germanic languages. But those shorts have really gotten a lot of attention. And so I've made a lot more of them. I originally just made like one or two. My wife and I were in Portland, and we saw some kind of fun things that I thought it would be funny to make like a little quick second talking about it. And then the one about the church, for example, got 300,000 views. So, if people want to hear that stuff, then I'll gladly give them more. It's easy to make. It's easy to put out. So yeah, definitely the shorts have been the thing that I've most been surprised with. I'll spend, maybe 12 hours making the video, like the day old video, the one about Anglo-Saxon mythology. That one was a lot of fun for me to make. Definitely probably not as wide of an audience of people interested in that stuff. But at the end of the day, it's fun and easy to make these kind of short form videos and people watch them. So why not? Moving on to questions from YouTube. The next one comes from ZoyMills9868. Have you tried to learn Sanskrit? What knowledge would you like to acquire next? I would love to learn Sanskrit, but I think that's kind of 20 years down the line for me. I have a sort of timeline in my head. I've really been spending a lot of time in Old English and Latin over the last few years, and consequently, I've gotten to a really comfortable spot in both languages. I can read Old English and Latin pretty comfortably at this point, and I can speak in them as well, which I think is very important when you're learning these languages. The next language that I have really been working on has been German, and then once I kind of get a little bit more comfortable in German, I think maybe I'll give it 6 more months. And then I really want to move on to studying Icelandic and Old Norse in a more serious capacity. I can speak a little Icelandic now, but I want to really be comfortable in that language. And then once I conquer that, I think I'm going to spend more time on ancient Greek. Again, I can read a little ancient Greek, I can speak a little ancient Greek, but it's really not a lot. Once I'm comfortable in Old Norse, then I'll learn ancient Greek. And then I think once I'm comfortable in ancient Greek, then maybe Sanskrit. I think that's kind of the last real language that I want to like seriously tackle in my sort of long form timeline for my like academic goals, if that makes sense. Next question is from Brahmsian. Graham, what is one book that you read as a young person that, looking back from where you're at now, made a significant impact upon the man you've become? C.S. Lewis's Till We Have Faces is probably what I'll say here. That book really, really changed the way that I thought about the world, and the way that I kind of carried myself intellectually and spiritually even. I'm only 25 years old, so I'm not going to act like I have some sort of wisdom to offer the average viewer that has probably been through a lot more than me. But at least when I was younger, I really liked Aristotle. I really liked categorizing things. I really liked having straight lines and sort of borders in my head. And reading that book was kind of like a splash of water in the face. It's a beautiful meditation on the human psyche, pun intended. And I think it is a really compelling call to view the world as a complicated and nuanced place, where a lot of interesting and weird things happen that we don't necessarily understand. I'll say Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis. Really, really beautiful book. And if you were wondering, my favorite piece by Brahms is definitely his First Symphony. I just love the beginning when you hear the sort of like, I know it's described as like the footsteps of Beethoven, in the back of Brahms's head, as the sort of beat of the drum, and the building like anxiety that he has of, am I going to be the next great composer? There's too much pressure on me. So good. Really reminds me of Lucan's Civil War, and how it's kind of like this sort of explosion of anxiety and frustration of his own pressure to become the next Virgil. I just love that aspect of Brahms's work, and especially in the beginning. Next question is from A. Hauser. I'd love to hear your thoughts on interpretations of wyrd and the attitudes towards it. I've seen it treated quite a few different ways by translators, and I get the impression that we can't pin down a single definitive attitude or idea about what it meant to people. Pagan personification of fate, luck, unknowable determinism, co-opted to mean Christian providence, mileage may vary depending on driver. Congrats on 10K. Thanks. So mileage may vary depending on driver, definitely, right? Like that's always how every word is going to be in every language. People use words in new and innovative ways all the time, and everyone is going to have a slightly different definition of the words that they're using. When we look at scholars like philosophers like Wittgenstein, we see that words sort of take on this sort of metaphysical state based on the collective usage of all of the users. And that's going to change over time because people use it differently. In terms of wyrd, when we think about words like fate and fortune in modern English, we're working in a Latin tradition. We're working in a tradition of scholars like Boethius, like the classical scholars of antiquity that talked about fatus and fortuna. When the Old English scribes received this body of classical information, they tried to render it into Old English as best as they could. And a lot of the time, they use wyrd to translate fatus, fortuna, stuff like that. That does not mean that that's actually what wyrd meant, though. And when we look at the purely Germanic sources, especially like Beowulf, the Norse sources are a great example. There are 3 norns. The first one is urthr, what has happened. Then there's verðandi, what is happening. And then there's skuld, which is going to happen. Urthr is the one that's cognate with wyrd, and that's what has happened. The Old English word for a historian is a wordritere, the one who writes the things that have happened. So that's what the word really means, is like events that have transpired. And the sort of connotation of like luck or chance, that's them trying to convey those Latin concepts in Old English by saying like, okay, yeah, well, wyrd sometimes can be like tricky and sometimes can really screw you over. And so like that's the concept that they're trying to convey here in these Latin texts. We'll use wyrd here. But you can't go the other way because wyrd doesn't have the connotations of fatus and fortuna, meaning like things that are going to happen, things that can like sort of play with your life. That's not what wyrd is. And the problem is when you look at a dictionary definition of wyrd, like on Bosworth Thaler, it gives you what happens, fate, fortune, and chance. And all of those words in modern English really give a connotation of the future, right? What happens? That is, what is going to happen? Fate, fortune, or what is my fate? What is my fortune? What's the chance of this happening? That's not what wyrd is. Wyrd doesn't have a forward-thinking connotation. There are other words in Old English that do. So in the famous line, wyrd oft nereth unfine erl, wyrd often saves or spares the sort of man that is not doomed. Unfine, that is unfai, that is fire means like doomed or like what has been predetermined for you. That's the Old English word that points forward. Wyrd is what has happened. So the word that's being used here, when it says wyrd oft nereth, it means like the trace of events, the sequence of events that have occurred have saved the people that were not doomed to die, that kind of thing. So here we have predestination occurring in a sort of preterite aspect of wyrd. But wyrd just means the things that have happened. So it's really not complicated. It's really not really up for debate, honestly. You just have to actually read the Old English and other Germanic languages as well, like specifically Old Norse, to get the sort of real sense of what that word meant. The next question is from Timilston4260. The pros and cons of retirees studying for degrees in classics and philosophy for personal enrichment versus self-study. I ask because I can't make up my mind. So it depends, right? In some universities, you are going to get every single dollar's worth of education. It really depends on the professor or the TA and how engaged they are, how passionate they are, how much they know, whether or not they're actually qualified to teach that course. You're going to have to do some personal discernment in that regard. The classes taught at, for example, Latinitas Animi Causa are going to be much cheaper, and those are also veritable experts in their fields. But it still does cost money, and what doesn't cost money is learning it yourself with free online resources. But again, there's got to be some discernment here, because if you have the kind of burning desire to learn about this stuff, then autodidacticism, that is like learning on your own, is going to be cheapest and easiest. If you are the kind of person, if you know yourself well enough to know that you're the kind of person who needs some guidance, and let's say you have a university that you know about nearby of professors that you've done research on, and you know that they know what they're talking about, and you see that they're teaching a course soon, and that's what you want to do, that's a really good way to learn. It's the university system. Like, that is how upper learning, at least traditionally, has occurred. And then let's say you're kind of in the middle, you don't really know whether or not you want to spend that kind of money. Then I would recommend places like an online class like Latinitas Animi Causa for learning things like Latin. And then I'm sure there's other options out there for like medieval courses and stuff like that. But even that is in its own way, kind of autodidacticism. At the end of the day, no one can force you to learn anything. So you should make a self-assessment on how much you can push yourself, because if you need someone to push you, that's where money is going to start coming in. The next question is from Raphael Ward 1711. Where were you educated? Who put you on your academic path? So I studied at the University of Maryland, and I got 2 degrees there. One was in history and one was in Old English. The person who put me on my academic path was my Old English professor, Tom Mosier. He's a great guy. Tom, if you're watching this, hi. And, he was very down to earth, and the kind of person who really makes you excited to want to know the things that they know. And he really encouraged me to try and get something published, which I think was a huge stepping stone for me. And once I had a publication, then I wanted another one. And that was kind of how I really forced myself to start learning and start really getting into academia in general. So yeah. The next question is in Latin, from Steel Madaka. Quod ad Latine discendum attinet, quid te maxime delectat? Ego opinor quidem ipse Latinitas animi causa me optime delectare, quia est locus optimus in quo homines Latine loqui discunt, et bene, sed et ceterum satura lonx est etiam optimus locus, et optima femina, et optima amica, et quid plus dicam? Quod ad discendum pertinet fortasse etiam dicam literae Christianae esse inter auctores vel tutuberes qui mihi quidem maxime placent, et nuperrime his diebus soleo etiam spectare pelliculas factas ab amicis nomine Cori Rousseau, etiam annula Rousseau, et hi homines maximi optimi homines pelliculas edunt, qui multum prosunt ad Latine discendum. Next question is from Real Badger Scrutiny. Has your studies changed or influenced your religious views? Yeah, I mean, totally. I'm naturally self-aware enough to realize that I don't have an extremely strong sort of intellectual constitution, is that I'm very easily swayed by convincing arguments, and consequently, any time that I'm reading anything that has to do with religion, I get to thinking about my own religious views, my own spiritual life. So, as an early medieval scholar, there's really no way to avoid, in my opinion, there really shouldn't be any way to avoid thinking about these things and having opinions on these things and being influenced by these things. If you're reading Augustine is one of the most influential and compelling writers ever. You have to at least think a little bit about what he's saying. Same thing is true for Boethius. You have to at least consider the arguments that he's giving, and in considering them, it will inevitably, if you have an open enough mind, at least broaden your horizon, force you to think about things, and perhaps further your understanding of yourself and the world. Next question is from Twitter, from Cameron. Tell us how you discovered Old English. In my case, it was a Victorian dictionary in the library of my high school. That's pretty sick. The first time I ever read Old English was before I started studying it. I was taking a medieval lit survey course with Tom Mosier. And yeah, we had to read Cadman's Hymn as just kind of an example of like, this is what English used to look like. This is what the oldest poem that we have written in English looks like, Cadman's Hymn. And we were told to record it in the original Old English. And we were given a recording of some poor professor who didn't really have very good pronunciation. And, you know, I tried to imitate that. And so in consequence, my pronunciation was horrendous. So I'm never going to show anyone that video because it's so embarrassing. But that was my first ever interaction with Old English. And, you know, I have this video of me standing in my backyard singing Cadman's Hymn at 19 years old. The next question is from Anglish Necromancer. What made you want to study Old English, Latin, and medieval studies in general? After college, how did you continue acquiring knowledge in those fields? Any study techniques and or resources you can share? So at this point, this is kind of like, you know, the third time that I've had this question asked. So I'll address specifically the Latin part. If you're learning Old English, you have to know Latin. And, you know, I have a lot of really, really smart and knowledgeable friends in Old English studies, and not one of them has avoided learning Latin at this point. Some of them were pretty averse to it, but at this point, they all know something about Latin. Even if they didn't intentionally try to learn it, they all can recognize Latin forms, Latin grammar at this point. And it is somewhat of a similar language grammatically to Old English. There are a lot of similarities, but anyone in the Old English period who could read and write was practically fluent in Latin. So naturally, most of what they wrote and read was in Latin. And if you want to understand them, you have to be able to read Latin. You have to be able to interact with Latin. And Latin begins in the classical era. So you can't really understand any of the medieval authors if you haven't read Cicero, if you haven't read Augustine, if you haven't read, well, I guess Augustine's not really classical, but if you haven't read Caesar, if you haven't read Cicero, if you haven't read, what's another classical author? Seneca. Seneca is another really important author on that time period. You have to read this stuff. So Latin is a lot of fun in its own right. And I love speaking in Latin and I love reading Latin. But the reason I wanted to get into Latin was because I needed it in order to really become well educated in Old English. As for study techniques and or resources that I can share, so I've got a couple of resources for learning Old English on this channel. If you poke around, you'll find some of them. Obviously, there are things like Oswald Bera. There are things like Lingua Latina per se illustrata. There are channels for learning Latin like Latinitas animi causa and Satura Lanx. And then there is the Old English Discord server, which is really the place that I started seriously learning Old English. I mean, there are a lot of people there who are really passionate about the language and know a lot about it. And there is a very easy, common, excuse to speak in Old English, which is the way that you're really going to internalize the language. People on that server talk in Old English all the time. And that is really so important to help you learning the language. So I really can't recommend enough, if you want to learn Old English, joining that server and trying to talk to people in Old English. The next question is from Vinlander. I'm curious about the differences in the West Germanic dialects that were spoken at the beginning of the 5th century, before they evolved into Old English. How much do we know? Wees du hal. Wees du ak hal, Leof. So the differences in the West Germanic dialects, we do know a good amount. Before the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes came to England in the Adventus Saxonum in around 450 AD, there were probably, let's say, 3 groups sort of on the coast of dialects. The Angles and the Jutes probably spoke basically the same thing, and we'll call that Anglian. When they get to England, they split into Northumbria, Mercian, East Anglian, and Kentish, Kentish being specifically the Jutes. But they probably were speaking essentially the same thing as the other Anglian dialects when they arrived. Then there are the Saxons, and when they come to England, they speak West Saxon, East Saxon, South Saxon, and then there's also the Old Saxons, which splits from them as a separate dialect. But when they're all living in the continent, they speak, we'll call that Saxon dialect. And then there are the Frisians, who probably at this point were speaking a different dialect already in sort of northern Netherlands. But it was very similar. All of these languages are very, very similar at this point. And then, of course, once the Adventus Saxonum arrives, then there's the split, and they start sounding different from each other. Our last question is from Truth Seeker. For those right at the beginning of an early medieval learning journey, what texts or books would you suggest to get started well? Well, I would say Lingua Latina per se illustrata, because you have to learn Latin, right? I mean, to study the Middle Ages at all in the West, you really ought to know Latin very well. And in the East, you really ought to know Greek very well. But, once you kind of get over the hump, once you start feeling comfortable in the sort of basic aspects of Latin, and you're ready to start like actually trying to read it, and you want to know what book should I read? What source should I read? What's most interesting to you is really, you have to answer that question with a question. What are you most passionate about? Because if there's a reason that you're interested in the Middle Ages, then that reason is going to be what's most compelling to you and what's easiest for you to study. Let's say you really, really like Boethius. You think Boethius is like a really fascinating philosopher, and you want to know more about him, and that's why you're interested in the early medieval times. Then read Boethius, who's, I'll admit, Latin is very difficult. But, once you get to the point where you can understand, basic aspects of Latin, just kind of throw yourself at that. Learn how he uses the language, get a real comfortable feel for it. Only read Boethius, read everything he's ever written like 100 times, and then, become an expert on it, because that's what's going to be mentally easiest for you if that's what's actually interesting to you. If you don't think Boethius is interesting and you'd rather read about wars and stuff like that, read the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, learn Old English, and, use the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles as your sort of guidepost for learning Old English. Learn the kinds of Old English that are in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. And in doing so, you'll acquire a lot of knowledge on the topic that you want to learn about, and you'll also get a good sense for the language, and you'll become a philologist. That's how it is. That's how it happens, is people study things that they care about, and then they become knowledgeable on those things, and then that knowledge becomes useful for other fields that relate to those things. Thanks for everyone who submitted questions. Thanks for everyone who's subscribing. Thanks for everyone who's a supporter on Patreon. It's really a lot of fun to do this kind of thing with you guys and to make videos and see all your comments and stuff like that. I have a lot of affection for all of my viewers and supporters. And I'm looking forward to the future and what's to come. Until next time, Farafye Isunde.